Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified. Here we will take up the news articles from The Hindu of Delhi edition and discuss them as per the demands of UPSC Civil Services exam. The topics for today's discussion are listed on your screen. Let us begin our discussion. The first article of today's discussion is based on this news, which featured at page number 13 in The Hindu. It basically talks about the delimitation exercise and an announcement made by Prime Minister of India during the inauguration of new Parliament building highlighted a plan to expand the representation in Lok Sabha by increasing the number of seats and members of Parliament. This topic is relevant under General Studies paper 2, in which functions and responsibilities of union is mentioned. Moreover, it is directly related to the election procedure in the country. And in today's discussion, we will try to analyze delimitation in detail. Before moving on to the discussion, let us have a look at these questions. A question was asked on the role of Election Commission in the light of evolution of Model Code of Conduct. And in 2015, a question was asked on simultaneous election to the Lok Sabha and state assemblies. Hence, the themes which are related to elections are important and recurring in UPSC mains exam. And this topic is important for prelims exam also. In 2017, UPSC asked that for election to Lok Sabha, a nomination paper can be filed by. Out of these four options, you need to identify the correct one. By looking at these questions, we get to know that elections and the themes which are related to elections such as delimitation are important for UPSC Civil Services exam. First of all, we will understand what is delimitation. It is a process of redrawing the boundaries of constituencies or electoral areas. And the idea behind this is to ensure that each constituency has roughly equal number of voters, which is based on the principle of one vote, one value. Moreover, after each census, readjustment is to be made, first in allocation of seats in Lok Sabha, and second, division of each state into territorial constituencies. And Parliament is empowered to determine the authority and the manner in which is to be made. Here we have briefly discussed what the delimitation is. Now let us try to have a look at Delimitation Commission. The Delimitation Commission is appointed by President of India. Try to remember this piece of information as it can be asked in UPSC prelims exam also. And what is the composition of this commission? It includes the Chief Election Commissioner, a retired judge of Supreme Court, and the Election Commissioner of the concerned state. Further, the orders of Delimitation Commission cannot be called in question before any court of law, including Supreme Court. And the copies of its order are laid before the House of People and the concerned state legislative assembly, but no modifications are permissible by them. And since independence, only 4 delimitation commissions have been constituted. And that was in the year 1952, 1963, 1973 and the last one in 2002. The key points which we have discussed in this particular slide is important for prelims exam. Now we will shift our focus to the impact of this delimitation exercise. The first one is balancing the political power. Delimitation exercise can alter the distribution of political power among different regions and communities, and the redrawal of constituencies can impact the electoral prospects of political parties and candidates. For example, during 2008 delimitation exercise, Jharkhand witnessed a significant realignment of political power when the boundaries of constituencies were redrawn. The second one is addressing the demographic shift. In 2002, constituencies in states like Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu were redefined to address the substantial population growth in urban areas. And it paved the way for better reflection of population changes and also ensured that the urban centers had adequate representation in legislative bodies. The third one is minority representation. The delimitation exercises have been instrumental in ensuring better representation for minority communities which are mostly underrepresented. And in 2008 delimitation exercise, constituencies in regions with significant concentration of minorities were adjusted to ensure that their political interests were adequately represented. For example, Malappuram in Kerala. Further, the delimitation exercise helps in improving the gender representation. During 2008 delimitation exercise, the constituencies in certain states were redrawn to facilitate reservation of seats for women in local bodies in order to promote greater participation of women in political process. And lastly, the fair representation. This delimitation exercise aims to ensure fair representation by readjusting the boundaries of constituencies based on population changes. Further, it helps in balancing the number of voters per representative, ensuring that each vote holds relatively equal weight and upholding the democratic principle of one person, one vote. Now we'll discuss the issues which are associated with delimitation. The first one is related to population, as delimitation exercise aimed at rearranging and standardizing the number of people per constituency, which may result in decreased representation for states that have achieved population stabilization. For example, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, which may further lead to increased representation for the states that are still experiencing the population growth, such as Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which have not yet achieved the population stabilization. Moreover, it creates asymmetry in the distribution of seats, as around 48% of the Indian population, as per the census data of 2011, is contributed by 5 states, which includes Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, West Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, and Maharashtra. Hence, it becomes a major issue and it creates a divide between North and South. The second one is related to administrative and logistics issue. Delimitation exercise often face the challenges in the implementation due to logistics and administrative issues. And the best example in this regard is Jammu and Kashmir, as delimitation exercise is facing delays and obstacles due to unique circumstances and complexities of the region. Now, what can be the way forward to this particular problem? The first one is the Commission can choose to implement freezing of seats until all states have achieved population stabilization. Further, Commission can develop a customized model inspired by Cambridge Compromise. It is one of the best practices in this regard by European Union. And this model would aim to provide a mathematically equitable formula for the allocation of seats, which are similar to the delimitation of seats in European Parliament. Hence, it can be implemented on pilot basis. And lastly, it is essential to ensure that delimitation process is carried out fairly, transparently, and with adequate consideration for the interest of all communities and regions. The topic of delimitation is indeed important for mains exam, as it often appears in the newspapers and is a significant aspect of political and electoral process in the country. So, you should be aware about the key issues which are associated with delimitation exercise. A quick recap to our discussion. First of all, we have discussed the context and its relevance for General Studies Paper 2. We have also seen the previous year questions both for mains and prelims. We have discussed what is delimitation and the Delimitation Commission, the impact of delimitation, and the issues which are associated with delimitation. And to conclude our discussion, we discuss the roadmap for future. Now we will discuss one case study which appeared in UPSC mains exam in 2018. First of all, you need to read the case very carefully to understand the crux of the case. As senior officer in ministry, you have access to important policy decisions and upcoming big announcements such as road construction projects before they are notified in public domain. So, you are a senior officer in ministry who has the access to important policy decisions. And the ministry is about to announce a mega project for which the drawings are already in place. Sufficient care was taken by planners to make the use of government land with minimum land acquisition from private parties. The compensation rate for private parties was also finalized as per government rules. Care was also taken to minimize deforestation. Once the project is announced, it is expected that there will be a huge spurt in real estate prices in and around that area. Meanwhile, the minister concerned insists that You realign the road in such a way that it comes closer to his 20 acres farmhouse. He also suggests that he would facilitate purchase of big plot of land in your wife's name at prevailing rate, which is very nominal, and in and around the proposed mega road project. He also tries to convince you by saying that there is no harm in it as he is buying the land legally. He even promises to supplement your savings in case you do not have sufficient funds to buy the land. However, by the act of realignment, a lot of agricultural land has to be acquired, thereby causing considerable financial burden on government and also the displacement of farmers. Further, it will involve cutting down of large number of trees which will reduce its green cover. Now the question says, faced with this situation, what you will do? Critically examine various conflict of interest and explain what are your responsibilities as public servant. You need to answer this question in 250 words. The framework which you can follow for this case study is, first of all, you need to introduce the case by highlighting the core issue. And in body, you need to address the core demand of the question, that what you will do in this particular situation. Also, you need to identify 3 to 4 conflicting interests in this case. And finally, your responsibilities as a public servant. You can conclude this answer with a generalized conclusion to deal with such a problem at national or global level. You can follow this framework to deal with the case studies which are going to be asked by UPSC in mains exam. Let us try to address the first part of the question, which says, faced with this situation, what you will do. As a public servant, you are faced with several conflict of interests that needs to be critically examined and resolved in a manner that upholds the principles of integrity and public service. And in this situation, you should firmly refuse the minister's request explaining that it is against the principles of fairness, transparency, and equal opportunity. And you should also emphasize the importance of following the original project plans that were designed to minimize the land acquisition and environmental impact. And any alterations to the road project should be based on technical considerations and the overall benefit to public and not on personal interests. In this way, you can address the first part of the question. Now we will see what are the conflict of interests which are involved in the case. The first one is personal interest versus public interest. In this case, the minister has a personal interest in this particular project, and the minister's insistence on realigning the road to benefit his farmhouse and facilitating the purchase of land in my wife's name is a clear abuse of power and unethical act. And on the one hand, it may lead to crisis of conscience for the officer, and on the other hand, will increase the cost of the project for government, which will eventually increase the burden on the taxpayers. The second one is government's objective versus minister's interest. The objective of government in this project is to minimize the land acquisition and the environmental impact. And on the other hand, minister wants to realign the project to get personal benefits. And the last one is means versus end. In this particular project, the minister is using illegal means to achieve his desired ends. And by realigning the road, a significant amount of agricultural land would have to be acquired, which will eventually cause displacement of huge number of farmers, and it also includes cutting down large number of trees, which goes against the goal of environmental conservation. And the last part of the question says, what are your responsibilities as a public servant? As a public servant, my responsibility is to serve public interest and ensure the fair and impartial implementation of government policies. Further, it is essential to prioritize the common good over personal gain and to adhere to the established rules and regulations. And in this particular case, it is important to note that the conflict of interests are common in public service, and it is important to be aware of them and take steps to avoid them. And the options which you can take is recusing yourself from certain decisions or seeking guidance from superiors. And in this particular case, if the minister still insists you to realign the project, you can report the minister's request to appropriate authorities, which can be your superiors, by providing detailed information about the conflict of interests involved. By doing so, you would ensure that the matter is investigated and appropriate action is taken to maintain the integrity of public administration. And to conclude your answer, it is your responsibility to prioritize the public interest, uphold ethical standards, and ensure the fair implementation of government projects. One must resist any attempts to compromise these principles and report any unethical behavior to higher authorities. By doing so, you contribute to enhance the trust and transparency in public administration. Moving on to the next topic of today's discussion, which is based on this news, which featured at page number 11 in The Hindu. It basically talks about the internet shutdowns in India. And the context is that over past few years, the Indian government has increasingly been trying to control law and order by shutting the access to internet, whether in Jammu and Kashmir, Manipur or Punjab. And between 2016 to 2022, 60% of internet shutdowns across the world took place in India. Hence, it is an important area under the functioning of executive and governance of the country. This topic becomes relevant for General Studies Paper 2, under which these two subtopics are mentioned. Let us have a look at the status of internet shutdown in India. India shuts down the internet services more than any other democracy in the world. And in the past 4 years, there have been over 400 such shutdowns across the country. Further, many parts of Jammu and Kashmir saw partial restoration of digital services after a long waiting period of more than 200 days, which was the longest internet shutdown across the world. And many UN rights groups termed these shutdowns as a form of collective punishment for people and also an overreach of government on citizens' rights and liberties. So, whenever a question is asked on internet shutdown, you can mention these points to substantiate your arguments. The focus of today's article will be the impact of internet shutdown in India. The first one is disruption of communication. Internet shutdowns restricts people's ability to communicate effectively, which affects both individuals and businesses. Moreover, people rely on internet for various forms of communication such as email, messaging apps, social media, and other services. Further, a shutdown can hamper personal communication, interrupt business operations, and hinder emergency services like medical emergency. The next one is economic consequences. As India has a rapidly growing digital economy, an internet shutdown can severely impact businesses and economic activities. For example, e-commerce platforms, online service providers, and startups heavily rely on internet connectivity to conduct transactions and serve the customers. And internet disruptions can lead to financial losses, reduce productivity, and increase unemployment, particularly for internet dependent industries. The third one is educational disruption. With the increasing reliance on online platforms for learning and remote education, particularly after COVID pandemic, the shutdown of internet services can significantly disrupt the education services, and students may lose access to educational resources, online classes, and more importantly, communication with the teachers, which will eventually hinder the academic progress and create inequalities among different sections of society. The fourth one is freedom of expression and information. The internet serves as a crucial platform for freedom of expression as it enables individuals to voice their opinions, access information, and engage in public discourse. An internet shutdown limits these rights and prevents people from expressing themselves freely. It also hinders the flow of news, restricts media coverage, and limits the public ability to stay informed. Hence, it is an important issue which violates the fundamental right under Article 19. The fifth one is political implications. Internet shutdowns are often employed as a means of controlling information flow and suppressing dissent. And mostly, the shutdowns have been implemented during protests, elections, or instances of civil unrest. And by restricting the access to social media platforms and messaging apps, government can impede the organization and coordination of protests and maintain control over the narrative. So it is a serious concern regarding internet shutdown. And the last one is psychological and social impact. The sudden loss of internet connectivity can have a psychological effect on individuals, which may lead to the feeling of isolation, anxiety, and frustration. Moreover, social media platforms also serve as a space for community building and social interaction. A shutdown can disrupt these connections, impacting social dynamics and personal well being. Hence, it is again a serious concern which is associated with internet shutdown. Here we have discussed 6 important areas under the impact of internet shutdown. Now we will go through the highlights of Anuradha Bhasin judgment of 2020, which is an important case to discuss in this particular context. The judgment mostly revolved around the fundamental rights which are associated with information and commerce, which comes under Article 19. The judgment talks about the freedom of speech and expression, and it says the freedom of speech and expression through the medium of internet is a fundamental right under Article 19 Clause 1 Subclause A. And the restrictions on internet have to follow the principles of proportionality under Article 19 Clause 2. The second aspect deals with the freedom of trade and commerce. Supreme Court highlighted that freedom of commerce through internet is also constitutionally protected under Article 19 Clause 1 Subclause G. And Supreme Court also said that any orders suspending the internet is subject to judicial review, and government should publish all the orders of prohibition to enable affected persons to challenge the same. And Supreme Court also held that government should consider other options or alternatives under Article 19 Clause 2 so that freedom of speech and expression is affected in least possible manner. Further, Supreme Court in Anuradha Bhasin judgment signals towards the theory of proportionality, which is often applied in constitutional law. It focuses to balance the objectives of government action against the impact on individual rights. And it lays down a 4-pronged test. The first one is legitimate goal test, which means whether the measure restricting rights serves as a legitimate goal. The second one is rational connection stage, which means whether the measure is suitable means for furthering this goal. The third one is the necessity test, which means whether there existed an equally effective but lesser restrictive alternate remedy. And the last one is balancing stage, which means if such a measure had disproportionate impact on the right holder. Hence, you can quote this particular judgment if a question appears on internet ban or a constitutional law which impacts the fundamental rights of the citizens, in which you can also mention the theory of proportionality. And what needs to be done in this particular regard? The first point here is there is a need for statutory recognition to important guidelines issued by Supreme Court from time to time. And second one is there is a need to enforce compliance and increase awareness about the important Supreme Court judgments which impacts the rights and livelihood of citizens. And to conclude your answer, you can mention that the strict compliance of Supreme Court guidelines on the part of government is needed to get rid of the tag of internet shutdown capital of the world and fulfill digital India's potential. A quick recap to our discussion. First of all, we discussed the context and its relevance for General Studies paper 2. We have seen the status of internet shutdown in India and the impact of internet shutdown on different sections of society. We also discussed an important judgment of Anuradha Bhasin with respect to internet shutdown. And finally, a way forward. Moving on to the next topic, which is based on this news, which featured a text and context page of The Hindu. It basically talks about the High Seas Treaty, which is also known as biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. And the context of this news is that on 19th June, United Nations adopted the legally binding High Seas Treaty. And this treaty is a result of 2 decades of negotiations over forging a common wave of conservation and sustainability in the high seas beyond national boundaries. This topic is important for General Studies paper 3 under Environment section. In this discussion, we will be focusing on the key provisions of High Seas Treaty and the contentious issues related to that. Before moving on to the discussion, let us try to understand what are the high seas. The high seas are defined by international law as all parts of oceans that are not included in the exclusive economic zone, the territorial sea, or the internal waters of a country. This essentially means that high seas and associated resources are not directly owned or regulated by any country. That is the reason why this treaty came into picture. Now let us discuss the key provisions of the High Seas Treaty. The first provision is protecting marine biodiversity. The treaty addresses the issues such as rising sea surface temperature, overexploitation of marine biodiversity, overfishing, coastal pollution, and unsustainable practices beyond national jurisdiction. The second one is establishment of marine protected areas. The treaty introduces the establishment of marine protected areas through a 3/4 majority vote, ensuring that the decisions cannot be blocked by small number of parties. And it further aims at protecting and ensuring the responsible use of marine environment and conserving the inherent value of marine biological diversity. The third one is fair sharing of benefits. This treaty mandates the fair sharing of benefits from marine genetic sources. It includes a clearinghouse mechanism to facilitate the sharing of scientific information and monetary benefits among all parties. The fourth one is open access to information. Parties to treaty are required to share and exchange information on marine protected areas, scientific and technical tools, and area-based management tools. This promotes open access to knowledge and collaboration. The next one is scientific and technical body. This body will be creating standards and guidelines for assessment procedures, conducting environment impact assessments, and helping the countries with less capacity in carrying out those assessments. This will facilitate the conference of parties to trace future impacts, identify data gaps, and bring out research priorities. So, it is an important provision under this particular treaty. And the last one is polluters pay principle. The treaty aims at strengthening resilience and contain provisions based on polluter pays principle as well as mechanisms for dispute. Moreover, under the treaty provisions, parties must assess potential environmental impacts of any planned activities beyond their jurisdiction. Now we will shift our focus to the contentious issues which are associated with marine biodiversity. The first one is marine genetic resources. The issue of sharing of marine genetic resources was a major point of contention during the treaty negotiations. The next one is information sharing. The absence of a provision to monitor the information sharing was debated, and some parties proposed a licensing scheme for monitoring, while others were of the view that it will create hindrance to bioprospecting research. And the last one is language used in treaty. The use of phrases like promote or ensure, particularly regarding the share of benefits from marine genetic resources, led to disagreement among parties. And lastly, the opposition to the High Seas Treaty. The first opposition is from developed countries. Several developed countries oppose the treaty as they support private entities that are involved in advanced marine technology research and development. And these entities hold patents related to marine genetic resources. And the next opposition comes from China and Russia. Both China and Russia are not in favor of the treaty. Russia withdrew from the final stage of reaching a consensus, arguing that treaty does not strike a balance between conservation and sustainability. A quick recap to our discussion. First of all, we have discussed the context, its relevance for General Studies Paper 3. We have briefly discussed the key provisions of High Seas Treaty, the contentious issues with respect to marine biodiversity, and the opposition to High Seas Treaty. One of the most important aspects of this particular treaty is that it is a legally binding treaty. That's all for today's discussion. Thank you for watching today's DNS. Stay tuned for upcoming sessions, which will enhance your understanding regarding the different topics which are coming in the daily newspaper.